So if people don't know me, if you haven't worked it out yet, I'm Jane Humphreys. I'm the ex-director of Children and Adult Services in Stockton Council. I retired last year. And before we go into a bit more detail about that, just obviously fire exits and toilets. Toilets are just out there. Fire exits, there's one there and there's one out through there. So we're not expecting any fire drills, so if something does go off, just follow me, I'll be running out. As I say, it won't take an hour and a half unless you've got squillions of questions. If it needs to take an hour and a half, that's absolutely fine, but the actual presentation is not that long. There are some evaluations, if you wouldn't mind just doing them at the end. This is something apparently you do. I'm not, whether you say I'm a good trainer or not, it's immaterial to me. I'm giving you a message. And obviously at the end there are time to ask questions, but if people want to chip in between, please feel free to do so. So, why are we having these sessions? And I did hear somebody was saying, I'm not quite sure what this is all about. And this is just my perspective, but actually it's one that certainly when I've reflected back to the department management team and Barbara and some of the ADs and some of the service managers actually, of what's happening in Redcar, what I'm seeing in Redcar, what I'm witnessing in Redcar. So I was asked to come in initially for a couple of months last year, by Barbara, primarily to support some interim and management arrangements in Redcar and give some support to Linda Bulmer and to Jane and a few other people who were either in new in post or interim in post. And as sort of time's gone on, I'm still here. And Barbara's asked me to do sort of discrete pieces of work. I've done a lot of auditing with Leslie. Leslie and I have done a lot of work around that, looking at particular pieces of practice. And if people have seen me before, you might have seen me at the staff consultation sessions where we're getting your views and getting your feedback about what was working well, what wasn't. And whilst I just got you all here, because I say one of the things I picked up from that was how well communication did or didn't happen. Can I just ask, has everyone seen the flyer, the note that went out last week that was from Barbara saying there's going to be some feedback about the staff consultation and DMT's initial thoughts on structural solutions? Well, there's a few. Right, well, there was a note went out from Barbara. So there are 4 sessions to end of February to beginning of March off the top of my head. And that will be feedback from those staff consultations that were before Christmas, but also some initial thoughts about structural solutions. So it would have come down through ADs, service managers.
All your team managers have had it. So if you haven't had it forwarded on, actually all of the team managers have a copy of it and it's been sent twice. I'm not, I can't guarantee in terms of disabilities because it would have come from a different service manager, but certainly all the fieldwork teams have team managers.
Now, I guess if maybe some of your managers were off last week and they're still off, there might be a bit of a hiatus. But there are, as I say, 4 dates. You don't have to book yourself on. They're obviously in bigger venues. But I think it is important that people get there because there's quite an interesting feedback about what you all said, but some interesting initial thoughts from DMT about how they might be able to respond to that. So my view of practice is that I think Redcar as a council is relatively compliant when you're looking at sort of process issues, and by that things like performance information. You generally look as a local authority, as a council, that performance-wise you're either doing quite well or you're middle of the road. You're not standing out there as a local authority that people say, what's going on here, what's going on there. Probably with the exception of your single assessment timescale. I think that's probably the one, if I was externally looking at it, I'd be thinking, what's happening there, what's the story? And obviously there is a story and people could articulate that. But when I look at the audits, and Leslie and I have done a lot of work, and I've led on that work, but when I've looked at previous audits, and then I've done some audits, I'm seeing the same old, same old. So I'm not seeing any learning. I'm not seeing that loop and the impact of that loop. I'm not seeing things coming back. I'm not seeing that challenge back about why is this still happening? Why isn't that improving? People are doing action plans or performance plans, but there's no change. And I still can't work out why that is. I think it possibly is a combination of reasons, and I certainly would be interested in people's views at the end about, maybe for some people it's about lack of clarity about what's expected. I think there's a bit about the policies and procedures that you had. You had that, I was going to say Michael Fox, but he was an actor, wasn't he? Fox Associates policies and procedures on a system. And it was rubbish. I mean, A, they were out of date, and B, it was a nightmare to get into. I mean, I gave up, and I had time to do it, so if you're all rushing around, so I can sort of see that they probably weren't used. There's been quite some changes of managers as well, and I wonder about that handover and that lack of continuity, I think, may have impacted. I suspect some of you are looking to your other colleagues who maybe have been here a bit longer and saying, how would you do this? How would you do that? And you might get the right answer, but you might not. And if you don't know what is the right answer. So I think there's a combination, but it's the same old things that we're saying. And you know, a good example is the private fostering audit. You've only got a small number of private fostering cases in Redcar at any one time. And it's a bit of an own goal if they're not perfect, those cases. Now, whilst I accept that you don't get lots, so therefore it's how do you do one of these? You know, if you do have the policy and procedures, if you had the training, if managers do know what's expected, then really you'd expect those to be perfect, and you'd expect the visits to be done, you'd expect the checks to be done. But actually, the last 3 years of audits, the one that I did with Leslie was probably the worst one you've had over the last 3 years. And that would concern me, and I know it concerns DMT, because that will be looked at when Ofsted come back in, and Ofsted will come into Redcar this year. That, you know, that is certain. So what DMT have asked me to do, or a couple of the sessions, is, and it's not about being patronising, it's about just going back to basics so that you're clear of expectations from Redcar, from the management team. But it'd also be what Ofsted would expect to see. And for those people who don't know, you know, I have now been, I'm a Ofsted additional inspector, so I've had the ILAC training. I haven't done an inspection yet, and I won't be doing lots because I'm not a full-time Ofsted inspector. But I know that, you know, what we're expecting of you here is what Ofsted would expect to see as well. So we're going back to basics. It's something I've done elsewhere, so I did it in my previous local authority. And I think it's just so that DMT can say, right, people have had that basic information, they know what the expectations are. But if there are barriers, then we need to know about it as well. So there's a series of 5 sessions. This is the first one, which is a basic overview about what a good case would look like. Then I'm going to lead with Joe Levy on the next session, which is chronologies, because you've got a big issue there, let me tell you. And those dates are out already, so do get yourself on those. And then Jane and Louise are going to do a session on assessments and what a good assessment looks like. And you are, over the goodness of time, over this year, probably into next, going to be adopting the science of safety model, which I think is a really, really good model, and I think that will really, really help you. And then Sharon, just seen Sharon. There's Sharon. Sharon and Wendy are going to do care planning and review, Wendy Med. And then Louise is going to do supervision, including that reflective supervision. So by the end of, I suspect, April into May, all of those sessions would be done. And, you know, I think when people were saying, like, you've had that information, you know what's expected, you know. There's work happening around the procedures, so Gary Rogers and Vanessa are looking at the work with Triac, so there will be some new procedures that are dead easy to use, and I say that as somebody who's not very computer literate. But it's just to say, going back to basics about what we're expecting. So, what does a good case record look like? And some say it might seem very basic, but, you know, people were talking to me the other day about, you know, do we have to go back to basics, saying when social workers do a home visit, sometimes they've got to actually, you know, go in the cupboards and go upstairs and have a look around. Absolutely, sometimes we have to remind people of that, because I've known of serious case reviews where social workers have visited and they've only ever visited the one room, and that one room was okay. The rest of the house was absolutely diabolical. So basic information, accurate information, the name of the child, young person. Sometimes they'll have an alias as well, won't they? They'll be known by another name, so it's important to put that down. Their date of birth, their address, including their, if it's not their primary address, their home address, the address they're at, you know, if they're looked after or they're in a private fostering arrangement. You know, you need to know the address that they're currently living at as well as their home address. Their ethnicity, their disability, their religion, language. And for some children, young people, we might expect to see birth certificate, passport, or photograph. Often your children in care, your children who have left care. So some of these are not for all cases, it's just for some children who are going to be adopted.
May I just add to that, Jane?
Yeah.
in protocol, the relationships tab offers you the opportunity to update who is the main carer for the child. That's really important because it might not be mum. So could I just add that to kind of Jane's?
I was going to say, well, shall we do, let's just say we'll add that to the slide. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'll add that to the slide, so that's a good point. You see, I don't know everything, and I thought I did. An up-to-date chronology, and really, I won't dwell on this too much, but I would expect if you've got a good up-to-date chronology, any of you who've never known the case would be able to look at it and work it out and sort of say, right, I can see why we're involved at the moment, I see what's been going on. And I give the example of, we did a multi-agency audit as part of the preparation for the Joint Target Area Inspection just before Christmas. And it was a good audit, and it was a child number 3, previous 2 children were not with mum. Mum who'd had various partners who were not ideal. And I'd looked at the chronology and I said, well, I can tell you what's going to happen with this case. I don't know when, but I'll tell you what's going to happen with this child. You know, mum's going to get another partner who's not great. There's all that disguised compliance. And eventually, you know, she'll get found out or something will happen and that child will come into care and that child will be adopted. Lo and behold, I mean, I didn't have a crystal ball, but a week later the team manager came around and said, guess what's happened? I said, and that child's come into care, and I'm sure the plan for that child will now be adoption. Now, I'm not saying you can say it every time, but when you're dealing with a lot of families like you are, where it's not the first child, you know, it's often second, third, and other children. If you've got a good chronology, you can see the patterns, and you can sort of think, right, well, this is probably going to go this way. Not always, but it's often a good predictor. And that is a real challenge for you in Redcar here. So we've got a distinct piece of work, a session on that. That's the second session. You want all the key documents on the file as well, and some of them, you know, will be relevant, some won't. So your section 47s, your outcome of strategy meetings, you know, findings in relation to certificate of harm are clear so people can see the outcomes of section 47. Good single assessments, which identify the risks and concerns, and you've got that robust analysis. And again, there's a specific session on assessments that Jane's going to do with Louise. And sometimes, not for all cases, you'd be doing care assessments as well. And sometimes that gets forgotten.
I think it's important to have those updated as well, Jane, because sometimes we see assessments that are years and years out of date, really.
Yep. So I can put updated assessment on there.
Change in circumstances, an opportunity to reassess.
Yeah. Care plans, obviously your child in need plans, your child protection, your children looked after, your pathway plan. At the moment, these sessions are targeted at those qualified staff and care leaving services, but ultimately a lot of this will be rolled down to the early help staff, so obviously you want to see early help plans as well. The plans are clear and based on sound analysis, so we can see why that plan is there, what was the reasons for it. They need to be reviewed regularly and updated. Now, obviously, your child protection and your child looked after reviews, you do have those frequencies written down, but your children need plans, you know, how robustly are they reviewed and updated. And that when we're involved with children and families, that the work we're doing is proportionate to the risk, so we're not going in there heavy-handed if we don't need to be. But likewise, we're not stepping down to early help if there are still concerns. And cultural needs are identified and addressed. We haven't got a big, massive BME population. I know we've got a number of, you get a small number of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Obviously, we've got quite a few Eastern European families, but it's just being mindful of cultural needs. Ultimately, in a care plan, we need to see and understand what difference we're making. We need to see that. We need to see what we're trying to achieve and how would we know whether we've achieved it. The voice of the child, young person, obviously we want to see evidence that that child, young person's voice is there. We want to see it written down. We want to see that you're speaking with children, young people alone, not all the time. It doesn't have to be every time. I don't want to see, and I'm sure nobody else wants to see you reading, you know, child age 5 is too young to give a view. That's absolutely, you know, there are children very, very young who are able to give a view. Might not be, you know, lots and lots of words, and some of it might be in pictures, but children very young can give views and you can get an understanding and feeling of what they're thinking. You want to see effective communication with parents and carers as well, and also absent parents. Sometimes that's overlooked. People who do have a significant interest or part, but maybe not part of that family household. So you want to be able to see that that's there as well. And that their views of family members and carers are clear, but ultimately, you're working with that child, that young person, but it's important to know what others around them are thinking and what their views are. Case recording needs to be timely and reflect workers' analysis and the child or young person's experience. And really, anyone, a bit like the chronologies, anyone reading the case notes should be able to sort of get an idea and a feel of what it must be like for that child, that young person, living in that environment that they're living in at that time. So it really is important that you can see that in your case notes and recording. Obviously the recording and minutes need to be accurate and up to date and spelt correctly. This is a big bugbear of mine, spelling. Oh, gosh, I go into restaurants, I go, that's spelt wrong. Pistachio spelt with an S the other day. I was like, that's no, it's got a C in it. Get changed off the menu. And I know a lot of people will have spell check or whatever it is. I mean, I don't use it, but it really is important. Some children, young people come back and read these records. And some of it is just, it's not the American colour and colour. It's just things that are just spelt completely wrong. And if you're not very good at English grammar, then please use something. And also, it's, managers, when you're signing things off, having a look at it, because it's not good.
June, I think it's sometimes remembering it's a child's file as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
When we had paper files years ago, you were more careful, I suppose. And when it's electronic, you can see where people are having email conversations on the child's file, and I think that's where we sometimes need to be a bit careful. Remember, it's a child's file, and it's got to be, if it's an email conversation to be had, it doesn't need to be a child's file. Sometimes it might need to be.
And that's a good point, because I was in another local authority recently, and I saw an email traffic conversation between two managers, which was very, very tense, and I had to raise it somewhere else and said, this is a child, they don't need to see that ding-dong in between, not ours, pass it on. So you're absolutely right. I mean, some things do need to be there, but others, and that's an interesting point as well, actually, because thinking about it, when you're sometimes having that email ding-dong, whether it's between yourselves or with partners or, health, police, whatever else, some people do put it on the record, but I'm not sure that people, when they're ding-donging, realise it's going to go on the record, and sometimes it might be appropriate. So when somebody does come and say, I want access to my file, and they see all this ding-donging, that sometimes can lead to a few delicate and tense moments, really. And thinking about that, when you are working and discussing with key partners and agencies, it's important to put their views and conversations you're having down, but be clear that it's theirs. Or if you've got an email, something from the health visitor, you would put it in saying, so-and-so came to the appointment and visit today. And then the other thing is recording, your views. You're absolutely entitled to your professional views, but it's about distinguishing between your views and facts. So, it's my professional view. I personally think this, but, distinguish that so it's clear. And particularly when you end up in court, and maybe giving evidence, and again, or if people come back and have a look at what's been written down, it's being able to see that working out. Management oversight is obviously key. Ofsted, that management grip, managers having a clear handle on the cases, supervision's taking place frequently, according to your prescribed frequency of supervision on those type of cases. You can see the managers are all over it. You don't want to be seeing you've had a supervision and the social worker's been told to update the chronology, and then the next supervision they're still being told to update the chronology, and the next supervision. That's not management grip. So it is about seeing that management oversight is there and that things are happening on the case. Obviously, key decisions are made and done in a timely way with a child and young person. If there is a delay, and often there will be delay, and there'll be genuine reasons and good reasons for that, it's just making sure that you put those down and record those down. And one of the key things I was, if it's not written down, it hasn't happened. And I think that's a key thing to remember, because again, if you end up in court giving evidence, and I gave an example yesterday, so I'll share it because it's on video. When I first started my career about 36, 37 years ago, I was dealing with a case of some children who came into care, and I'd had a discussion with a guardian ad litem in those days, people in that time, years and years ago, they were seen as the best things in sliced bread, and social workers were somewhere down there. And the courts would always go with what the guardian said. And I had a discussion with this guardian, and basically in court, he lied about what I'd said. But the court believed him. I mean, the outcome for the child and young person was not negative, but he believed him. And the judge at the time was Peter Fox, who, you know, is retired now. But in his summing up, he said, at best I was incompetent and at worst I was a liar. I mean, I haven't got a transcript and I kept it for like years. So you think, I must move on from that. And from that day onwards, I never ever, you know, found myself in that situation where I wasn't, because I hadn't written down the conversation. And never ever since that time has anyone ever been able to say, I didn't say that, or I didn't say that. And sometimes people have said it, but forgotten that I sent that email, or I sent this, and you just wham it off. And it really is a useful lesson. You know, it may have happened to some of you, but, you know, even when I'm having a phone conversation, I wham an email off and just saying, further to our phone conversation, just confirming what we said. And if they don't come back, you can assume they've agreed with that conversation. And of course now, it's so much easier, isn't it, when you've got email? I mean, you know, when I first started off, it was hard files and phone calls, and you just had to write it down. Another thing that often we forget about is entitlements for children and young people, and evidencing that they're aware of that, particularly, you know, some of your children looked after, your children needing care, children with additional complex needs. And often, you know, particularly when Ofsted might come in, you've got some of your teenagers who are a bit got out the wrong side of the bed. And Ofsted will say to them, do you know about your entitlement? Do you know about your health passport? Do you know about what you're financially? And they'll say, no, and my social worker never tells me anything. And we know that's not true. But if you haven't recorded it down, or you haven't got the bit of paper and just said, just sign here, or you haven't reminded them at the review, again, I'm not saying it's one word against another, but it's just so much easier to say, well, actually we did, you know, 2 months ago when he was at his review, we told Johnny about this. So it is important just to remember that. And also the local pledges and charters. You know, you've got pledges and charters for your children in care, and you'll have an SEND charter, I'm sure. So just reminding yourselves of that. None of the work you're doing is, you know, made up. There's all there in legislation or in guidance. You've got your LSCB procedures. This is an exhaustive list. And, you know, when you're looking at the procedures and the TRIACS work that is happening now, if you went onto any local authority website, 85–90% of the work you do would be the same work in Stockton or Derby or Westminster. You know, it's the same old work, it's the same old job, because it's all set down there. You know, the only variances would be just slight things about which panels you go to or where the signing off is. So it's just reminding ourselves of that as well. Any inspection will look at the last 6 months of the work that you've done. Now, they may need to go back a bit further just maybe to understand the story, but if you've got a good chronology, they won't need to go back. And again, that's the thing. If they've got a good chronology, when Leslie and I have been doing these audits, I've said, let's look at the chronology, and then we've sort of given up and had to move on to something else. But if I'd seen a good chronology, say, right, I can understand all that. Let's have a look at the key documents, right, they're all in there. And then we'll have a look at the last 6 months of case notes. They want to see current practice. But if they can't find some of those basic things, A, they'll start looking around and about, B, they'll get a bit hacked off and think, oh, you know. And, you know, we found, Leslie and I found it takes probably 3 times as long to audit a case that's not in good order compared to a case where everything's where it should be. And that last bullet point there, that's not me saying that, that's out of the Ofsted guidance. So they are looking at children's experiences. And as I've said at the beginning, Ofsted will be coming into Redcar this year. You just don't know what you're going to get. And there's an annual conversation takes place each year with each local authority. Yours is the beginning of March. And I know that Redcar are preparing a self-assessment about where you think you're doing okay, where there's areas for development. And, you know, the key is to be honest and upfront, because if you're not honest and upfront, you know, that you've got nowhere to go, really. You could get a 2-week standard inspection, you might get a focused inspection, you might get a joint target area inspection, you might get an SEND inspection, although the SEND inspections are separate to the others. Obviously your SIF was last year. You got good overall for your looked after and leading care and your adoption. Your help and protection was sort of your vulnerability. You know, one might think that if you were going to have something this year, it might be around your help and protection. but that's not to say they won't go and have a little look at your looked after just to see that it's still as it was. So, you know, it is important to make sure that you've got some of these basics in place. And, you know, I think that Barbara's take on what it really will be, and certainly from the chronology thing, it'll be at a point in time we say, that's it, enough's enough. These things have got to be in place now. And the conversation with Ofsted will be, we know we've had variability. We're going back to basics. And at a point in time, this is our expectation, and not doing it is not an option, really. And hopefully then, if Ofsted were to come in, you know, at the end of the year, they should see that difference. And ultimately, that's, you know, the local authority making good decisions for children and young people. That's the end of the presentation. Any thoughts, any comments, any observations on my observations of you as a local authority? Does it seem a fair reflection? Am I being too harsh?
I think back to the inspectors coming last January, and obviously years gone by, and I can't believe it's gone that quickly, but your last slide there, I remember the inspector literally practically throwing some plans on the table at me and saying, what do you think of these? And I knew they were bad, and I said, they're not very good. And he said, I'm glad you said that, because obviously they weren't, and I couldn't have hidden it anywhere. But it's the last bit, when they went and spoke to the young people, and they delved deeper, and they went to the groups, and their voice had the weight, and ended up we got a good, and it was great.
Yeah.
But and it's still, we're sort of in a similar position, you know, from the last legal care audit, that there's still some issues, there's still that, and it is trying to record everything that you're doing, because you've got that daily, you know it's like in the UK, you've got that daily complex, vulnerable young people coming. You're doing the doing, and you're doing the face to face and all the good stuff, and then it's the recording, it's the evidence in it that we fall down on. And it's trying to get that balance.
Yeah.
But you don't want people sat at a desk
No.
behind a computer all day. You really don't.
Yeah.
And the young people downstairs need to be seen.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, because I have no doubt there's lots of good work going on. But if you're just looking at a file, it often doesn't translate. And there is an art to actually writing down what you should write down. And sometimes more is less. And it's just being able to get some of those key things. Can you see that child in your case recording? Can you see the key things that have happened in that child, young person's life? And if you've got all that, you're absolutely right, because when the Ofsted come, they'll be talking to you as social workers, and they'll be talking to your children, young people. And they'll know if you're talking and they can say, you know your case, that child and young person, you know, you're going to get credit for that. It isn't completely about. But if the case tells you nothing, bearing in mind that's a child, young person's record that they may come back to, then, you know, it is absolutely getting that balance. What I'm not certain of is it's about why is it that it's the same old, same old.
It's maybe we don't properly build in something that reviews our action plans and what we do. So we're concentrating that much every day on what we're doing in the daily grind, in a sense. That even as managers, as service managers, we're not dedicated, probably, you know, if I think of my unit, I can only talk from my experience. So it's having that dedicated time to get together to say, right, let's not worry about what's happened at DMT and what the feedback is from key meetings and all that general stuff that we do every week. Let's spend this 2 hours focusing on our action plan. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't do that enough. You know.
But I guess the other thing for me, if everyone was doing what was expected of them, and it is basic stuff. I mean, it is basic stuff. You know, social work. I'm not saying, you know, it's not challenging. The families we deal with are incredibly challenging. We're going in because we have to, not because they want us to. You wouldn't need those action plans, and you know, and the action plans that nothing's happening, and I just don't get what it is, and you know, whether or not because, and ultimately at the moment there are no consequences, but I think, you know, I say going forward, not doing something is not an option, because you can't keep doing that.
Has any work been done, Jane, with like the workforce around what they think the barriers are? I suppose if we know, and from these sessions actually things aren't not getting any better, but the same patterns. Has anything been done to talk to workers about like barriers?
Well, I mean, this is part of this would be an opportunity. You know, people might say, you know, what is it?
People put the hand up in these.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know whether Louise has picked anything up in sort of some of the work you're doing.
I think there's a couple of bits that I've picked up. within Redcar Cleveland, and I think, and this is not a criticism of individuals, but I think it is a whole system issue, is that people don't value quality assurance. So there's an awful lot of work goes on around looking at the quality of things. I don't think there's necessarily a buy-in across the whole department around what quality looks like, what do we expect, and then if we don't know what we're expecting, how do we then make it better? So I think it's a cultural issue. I also think I think people do feel like they're too busy to do anything differently. But I think it's how to break that. So if you always do what we always do, then nothing is ever going to change. But I think as Jane picked up, and certainly Leslie and I have picked this up in audits and fed back when we've done the double loop feedback, people are incredibly busy, and there's lots of things that are recorded, but actually sometimes people are recording the wrong kind of thing. So if we did less of that and more of something else, I think we will see a difference.
I think also we've got to try and get the idea of performance helping us rather than being a hindrance, because I know within my unit people just think of getting rid of your reds, and they should be looking behind as to why it's red. And actually I don't get too worked up and worried about having reds, because if you've got the story and you've done the visit but you haven't yet, there's always a story, and there's nobody intentionally doing bad practice. There's really good practice out there, but people get so caught up in the performance when actually instead of utilising it to the benefit, they think, well actually the reason why we have, because we need performance management and we need those reports and we need to be able to monitor, because that's your basics, that's your absolute basics, your health, your health, your dental, your visits, and it's not being frightened of that. I'd rather see a red than someone pretend they've done something just so the protocol looks nice, and then people stay off the back and say, well, actually I've got no reds. When you look at some of the no reds, they're actually not.
Well, and that's the bit, you see, that's the bit that I think about Redcar is, I mean, you're absolutely right, because performance indicators, they're there because generally they're a tool that says generally if you've got these are working well, they're usually an issue about good practice and good outcomes. But I'll give you a really good example of one that I always thought, the adoption scorecard. The adoption scorecard, you can actually you can be way out with your days, but actually if you've got children waiting to be adopted, who are not little babies, they're a sibling group, one with complex needs, they're going to be way beyond the adoption card, but the outcome for that family is to keep them together and for them being adopted and not break down. Any good director, any good group of members would say, never mind the adoption scorecard, we want what's best outcomes for children and young people. And I think the bit about, as I said at the beginning about Redcar is, generally you are very compliant with your performance information, which will lull some people externally into a false sense of security. They then come in to look at practice and it's not quite right. And, it isn't about beating people with a stick around performance, but generally that is a good thing, the performance indicators, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And as long as you know the story, that's the key thing. If you don't know the story, well, you can't give the explanation. If you know the story and you can articulate that, or you've got sort of plans in place if the story is one that's not particularly positive, but it's because of these reasons, then that's fine. Yeah.
I've had inspectors say you haven't got 100% pathway plans completed, and there's been a simple answer because the children aren't 16 yet, it's not due for 2 months. Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
So you can, you can't pretend you've got to just know your bits, haven't you? And adoption is a really good example because do you remember the year when if you got 2 reds, you got a letter to the chief exec and a phone call to the director?
I got a visit.
And that was ridiculous.
5 civil servants came up to see me and I sent them back down the road with, good work.
Because you had complex sibling groups that you were searching for, and good director, the AG, service manager, whatever, would say, we're not rushing these children, and if it goes red and it's out of time scales.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think there's too many variables as well, so I think it changes from manager to manager.
Yeah. I think there's some issue of continuity.
Even basic standard templates, such as your core group template, your child in need template, the way to gather a good assessment, and there's so many different examples across the authority, and I think as a management team, certainly from our unit, we are trying to standardise that. We're saying, right, that's the core group template,
Yeah.
that's your case notes standard, that's the content of that. And I think once we get those basics sorted, we can then focus on the quality element of it, can't we?
I think continuity or lack of it or changes has probably impacted on you. And as I say, I've been to a few local authorities now where continuity is been an issue. You know, that's not criticism, it's just people leave or people move on, they move on. But coming from a local authority where I was like there forever and everybody else was there forever, you suddenly realise how continuity can be a really good thing to a certain degree. You know, sometimes you need, and that intelligence and that history and that, you know, but where you've had people moving on or different managers saying different things and different expectations, then people invariably, I suspect, are going to get confused. And
I think it was paramount to me. We had an agency worker who's just left yesterday, and what she was saying is, when I took over case line management responsibility for her in September, I was then saying, right, I want that core group template, right, I want that template on case notes. And she was saying, well, other managers have said they want it that way and this way. And what she said, what would be really helpful as a new start coming in, and probably something we can think about, is getting together a standard pack of saying, that's the core group template, that's the case note. So then we're all uniformed, aren't we, across the board, and then we can drive standards forward and up from that, really. But we need a baseline to start
no, I agree
from.
with you. Yeah. Any other thoughts, observations, comments? No? Can I just ask you to just scribble in a bit on the evaluation sheet? I think there's, is that a spare one? Yeah, there's a few spare here. Yeah. Is that enough, yeah? Two?
Thank you.
Got two.